right, thanks everyone. I called this the multifaceted impact of community composting. So really looking at all the different global issues that community composting touches on. Community composting touches on a lot of major issues. One of the reasons why it's gaining so much more political attention these days is because of more political will put towards climate change mitigation. And so it can have a major role to play in that, in diverting organic waste materials from the landfill, which can generate methane. And putting them into the soil where it can sequester carbon, so it has a dual benefit in that way. Also helps us to reduce waste overall, and really helps us to kind of rethink waste. One of the things that I like to kind of think about is it's really cool that you put what we think of as waste into the compost pile, and it pretty much just disappears. And turns into soil fertility and a source of new life and new growth and new potential. And so I find it a very powerful way to think about waste, just from a metaphorical perspective, that waste is a transformational resource. And so that is a way to guide us in thinking about how we can transform our waste management systems in general. Compost helps us to improve soil health, has many benefits to the soil. Also, community scale composting helps us to alleviate environmental justice issues. So I'll be talking about all of these details as we go forward. Beyond that, supports community well-being. So not just kind of disrupting the destructive systems, but also building helpful and healing systems, and really kind of creating a vision of holistic health. So community scale composting also allows us to increase access to healthy soils and healthy food. For people who don't have access to them, industrial scale facilities are oftentimes a few hours away from the community in which the waste material is being produced, and people don't really have access to the finished product as easily as if it was a hyperlocal system. One of the first kind of compost teachers I had, his name was Carl Hammer, and one of the first things he ever said to me was that we are all walking phases of the soil. And I really appreciated that quote and concept, and he took it very seriously. And he talked to us about how soil transforms, the energy of the soil transforms into the food and the animals, the plants that we eat, and into our bodies, and we all return to the soil in the end. So we all come from and return to the soil and go through different kind of transmutational phases through that process. And so that common process connects us to all life and all living beings, and is a source of universal connection and perspective. So I found that to be very powerful, and I love to kind of share that. And one thing I always like to say to people is that soil is a mirror, and that the way that we treat our soils is a direct reflection of how we treat our bodies and our communities. And so if we want our bodies and communities to be healthy, then we need our soils to be healthy as well. And we can't have one without the other, because we are in direct relationship with each other. So as many of you know, we have global climate change issues, and one of the things that happens is the greenhouse effect, where radiation from the sun, like some of the gases in the atmosphere, such as carbon dioxide or methane, absorb more of that heat and helps to warm the atmosphere. So generally a positive thing for life on Earth, otherwise it could be too cold. But because we have been engaged in industrial activities over the last 100 years or so, we have vastly increased the amounts of greenhouse gases, such as carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, in the atmosphere, which has really significantly contributed to global warming and caused global temperatures to rise. And so we really are wanting to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that we're putting into the atmosphere in order to keep our global temperatures habitable for us. So this is a quick video from Kiss the Ground that I thought was pretty fun, so I'll just show it to you guys.
Have you ever looked at a banana peel and wondered, is that it? All that time spent nurturing the banana and now it's just waste?
Could this humble peel serve a greater purpose?
Currently, in the US, over 60 billion pounds of mineral-rich food material go to landfills each year.
Imagine if we diverted those billions of pounds from the landfill and turned them into compost.
Imagine our cities, vacant lots converted into food forests. Imagine abundance everywhere.
And it can help reverse climate change.
But most likely, it won't. Why? Because we're insane.
We define waste as anything unused, unproductive, or not properly utilized.
But waste is a human invention. We're the only creatures on Earth who don't live a zero waste existence.
Yep, thanks to trillions of microbes that are in and around everything, including us.
Anything that lives gets repurposed and contributes to the growth of new life.
Some 500 million years ago, these microbes brought plants onto the land.
The microbes provided minerals and water in exchange for carbon sugars produced by the plants through photosynthesis.
This resulted in a terrestrial explosion of life.
More life meant more excretions and deaths, which meant more food and nutrients for decomposers, and all soil life, known as the soil food web.
This increased the abundance and biodiversity of ecosystems and turned barren land into fertile soil.
Today, composting mimics this natural upcycling process, transforming combinations of organic material into life-filled, nutrient-available organic matter.
Compost isn't just mulch, manure, or food waste on its own, nor does it stink. Compost has the aroma of the forest floor after a rain.
It also has superpowers. Compost can enhance food nutrition, increase crop yield, and strengthen plants' immune systems, all while increasing the soil's water-holding capacity. And compost stimulates plant growth by bringing in microbial life, nutrients, and water-retaining humus to depleted soils.
More plant growth takes even more carbon out of the atmosphere. Microbes feed plants. Plants feed microbes, and the self-regenerating soil carbon pump cycles on, building soil.
Compost is a regenerative substance. It isn't just fertilizer. It's an essential microbial source, a probiotic for the land beneath our feet.
Now, while we've made some great progress recycling paper and even composting yard trimmings, currently in the US, over 50% of trash going to landfills is food scraps, paper, yard trimmings, and wood, all compostable materials. We are throwing away the very building blocks of life. Only 5% of our food scraps get composted. 5%. That means over 60 billion pounds of mineral-rich food material, much still fully edible, the weight of 4.5 great Egyptian pyramids, go to landfills each year. And there it rots, creating methane gas, a greenhouse gas up to 86 times more potent than CO2. And it's not just food. Grass, leaves, and clippings, all designed by nature to fall back to the ground and increase fertility, are shipped miles to landfill. Now that's insane. Some city governments are finally stepping up by providing green bins to make composting more available, but too often they're misused. Toxic material, trash, is being mixed with the stuff we grow our food in. Just stop it! Don't put toxins or non-organics in that bin, please! Our current agriculture system robs our soils of carbon and biology, replacing them with chemicals, leading to more degeneration and desertification. We've broken the regenerative loop of life. It's crazy.
Without soil, life on land as we know it is impossible. And soil without life, it's just dust.
If the soil is being stripped of its life-giving qualities, what can help save our future? Properly made compost. The soil would be spongy again, retaining water and restoring our underground water supplies.
Fertile farms producing tastier and more nutritious food and no longer covered in toxic chemicals.
Imagine a farm to table to compost to farm system.
This is the regenerative system our future depends on. And doing it at home is easier than you think. You can't at home? Use your green bin. If you for some reason don't have a green bin, request one from your city. Or find a neighbor or community garden who can use your compostables.
Cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, St. Louis, and my hometown, New York, are leading the charge. Thank you.
Countries from Haiti to Australia are using compost to address food security and desertification.
Schools, hospitals, and restaurants are waking up to composting their food scraps.
Scientists and compost manufacturers are improving methods, making our superhero even more powerful.
Yes! Life isn't over for the humble peel. Along with other organic material, it can help restore fertility to our soil, regenerate our food systems, clean our water.
And it can help reverse climate change. Really.
Okay, so what can you do?
Do all you can to support composting.
If we're to keep the planet habitable, human beings must participate in regeneration.
Each of us can play a role to help regenerate our planet simply by composting.
The cycle of this can make or break us. You choose.
Here's a more technical graph, I suppose, looking at the anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, which is anthropogenic just means human-made. So these are attributed to human industries. So if you can see the graph, you would see that the kind of bottom orange part, which is like the majority of the system, shows that most of the CO2 that's contributing to global warming is from the fossil fuel industry and industrial manufacturing processes. And then there's a slice of red, which I believe is CO2 from land use changes and forestry management. So that's more related to kind of the work that we're doing. And then there's a light blue slice that's showing, so the bottom axis, the x-axis is the year over time, and then the y-axis is kind of showing the greenhouse gas emissions in terms of carbon dioxide equivalents. So you can see those numbers rising over the last 50 years or so. So the parts that are concerning or related to the work that we're doing with compost has to do with land use management, so CO2 coming out from that. When we kind of cut down native forests, native habitats, prairies, in order to transform them into agricultural or cultivated lands, that results in a loss of CO2 to the atmosphere. And when we're practicing kind of industrial monoculture type agriculture, that also contributes to greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. And there's I think one of the pieces is methane as well on the light blue slice. So it's also a significant contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. Methane is, the video said, like 80 times more potent at warming the atmosphere than carbon dioxide. Other estimates are around 20 or 30% more potent at warming the atmosphere than carbon dioxide. So just to kind of contextualize kind of the role of composting as a tool in toolbox for dealing with climate change and supporting climate change mitigation. This is a look at the U.S. methane emissions from, I believe it's the EPA. So landfills contribute about 16% of methane emissions. Manure management, which is more industrial scale manure management, contributes about 9%. And then we have our natural gas and petroleum systems, that's 31%. Enteric fermentation is 27%. So the compost is mostly related to our landfill methane emissions, and potentially could be involved with supporting better manure management as well. Even though the manure management is related to kind of our industrial food production system, If we are able to kind of transform to more regenerative practices, then we can, prevent that kind of methane emissions from manure that comes from our industrial systems. Enteric fermentation is from cows in their stomachs, something that they're releasing, and it's related to the manure, so it's related to the industrial food system. This is a graph kind of showing the waste trends in the U.S. From 1960 to, this is from 2015. So the blue triangle you can see is over double increasing, and then the orange square is the per capita generation, which is also increasing, but mostly it's increasing due to population growth. And so, landfills are filling up, and if that's our main waste management strategy and we're constantly trying to produce more of them, it's an unsustainable practice. Breaking down the municipal solid waste in the U.S., about 52% is going towards landfills, and about 25% is going towards recycling, and about 8.9% is going towards composting. And then the last part is combustion, which is kind of like waste incineration, which is kind of a toxic practice. If you want to learn more about it, the Institute for Local Self Reliance has a really great report on it. So just kind of showcasing the opportunity for more recycling and composting kind of integration into our waste management process. And this is a breakdown of the total solid waste in our waste stream. And so oftentimes we talk about composting food, which is about 15%, yard trimmings about 13%, so it's about 30% of the waste stream that's compostable. Technically, if they were all kind of natural materials without treated like synthetics integrated into them, the wood and rubber, leather, textiles could also potentially be compostable. If they're like natural fibers, then they can be compostable as well. Things that don't compost, glass, plastics, metal, we try to keep those out of the compost pile. So just to kind of showcase the opportunity for better recycling and composting, almost half of that graph could be recycled or composted. And from a broader perspective, composting contributes to a regenerative, localized food system, and that can also support climate mitigation from a whole systems perspective. So some estimates consider that food systems contribute about 20 to 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions. That's including pre-production from the fertilizer, animal feed, and pesticide production to actual food production, which includes like land use change, cutting down forests or prairie or native habitat in order to create cultivated agricultural land, contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. And then the whole post-production process of harvesting, processing, packaging, refrigeration, transportation, distribution, retail, all of that can be very resource intensive. And so in kind of promoting these more localized, community-oriented composting, farming, food production systems, we really cut down on all of these contributors to emissions, such as fertilizer and pesticides, such as transportation issues. So just to kind of provide that perspective, that it's not just like the methane and the soil carbon sequestration, but also kind of on a more community and systems level contribution to climate mitigation. Soil degradation is a global issue because of a lot of those processes that I've talked about. And it's kind of characterized by a decline in soil quality. And so we have to kind of create a definition of soil health and soil quality. And so we kind of define that by a loss of organic matter, which I'll talk a lot about in our soil section. Basically, anything that comes from a plant or an animal is considered organic matter. It could be in decay. That's generally in decay. A loss of fertility, which is ultimately provided by the soil microbiology. So the plant available nutrients, beneficial enzymes, and things like that are lost in a degraded soil, and the soil is not able to provide the kind of nutrient cycling benefits, services. A loss of structural integrity. So we'll talk about aggregate stability, which is about how the soil clumps together. And I've got kind of a display of different types of soil and compost, and you can kind of check out the way that these different soils kind of clump together. I think that worm compost is a really great example of like what kind of soil aggregates look like, because it's very like clumpy. But the main thing I wanted to point out was kind of that structure. So the worm compost is a nice example of that. And then there's some like vacant lot soils here where they don't clump together very well. And that has a lot to do with the biology contributing to that structural strength. So when you lose that structural integrity, then you're vulnerable to erosion. So when you have a large rainfall or winds event that can wash away or blow away your soil. And so to prevent that, you strengthen the structure and it doesn't blow away as easily. So yeah, erosion, major cause of soil degradation, just pure kind of soil loss. Salinization is a process where soil accumulates more and more salt over time, and that makes it difficult to germinate and grow crops. They kind of need more and more water to overcome that salinization process, and it's a kind of a trend in more like arid or semi-arid climates where salts will accumulate because of like the cycles of like wetting and drying. Also, we have a lot of toxic pollution from our industrial processes, industrial manufacturing processes that kind of unload a lot of contaminants into the soil sometimes. In urban areas, lead is a major issue, as well as other heavy metals. Sometimes there's spills of petrochemicals or other pollutants. We have issues in our compostable packaging of like weird chemicals getting in there. So that's always something that kind of comes up. And it's especially because compost is like where all of our waste material goes. A lot of those kind of contaminants can show up in the compost pile just because of the upstream processes. Excessive flooding can contribute to erosion and loss of fertility. Also compaction, such as like a lot of construction or development or sealing of the soil, degrades the soil and blocks its ability to kind of have a role in atmospheric kind of nutrient cycling and atmospheric regulation and climate regulation. So there is a kind of commonality that many great kind of civilizations had trouble with their soil. There was the invention of the plow, which made it easy to farm. And as the population grew, like people wanted to grow more food, but that is kind of an intensive process that kind of disrupts the soil structure. You get a quick boost of nutrients and fertility when you plow, but over the long term, it makes it difficult for the soil microbiology to establish itself and for the soil structure to establish itself. It's kind of like, in your own house or your own community, if there was like a giant tractor plow that was like churning up all of the homes in your community, it takes a long time to rebuild and reestablish your community. Especially for like fungi, they grow like long threads in the soil, and so they really help in a lot of different ways, retaining water and building structure. And so when you rip that up, it makes it difficult for the soil biology to do its thing, to make the soil strong, to do nutrient cycling. So there's a couple examples of civilizations, like in Mesopotamia. It's kind of an arid climate, but they were doing intensive plowing and also kind of excessive irrigation that would lead to salt buildup in their soils, and that led to kind of famine, their soil kind of tiring out in the end. So when you lose the biology and the organic matter, then you lose your like fertility and nutrients in the soil. So in the long term, plowing is like not that great for maintaining soil health. That happened in China, where when populations grow and you try to look for more farmland, people would go from fertile floodplains to like mountain top slopes. And that caused a lot of erosion when they converted those sloped areas to farmland. And there's a severe drought and famine in China that was due to some of those farming practices and the erosion that happened from that. Greece and Rome, similar things happened. Like people understood the importance of like manure and compost in soil fertility, but ultimately the, fast production of the plow kind of won out, and so they struggled to keep their soils healthy. And many of their philosophers mentioned like how kind of poor the soil quality was becoming. Like originally the Romans were doing kind of agroforestry practices, but because of like economics and politics, like the kind of practice of doing more kind of large scale, intensive plowed agriculture kind of won out in the end, and also contributed to food shortages and famine and political instability from that. There's a great book by David Montgomery called Dirt that goes into a bunch of that stuff. Okay, this is probably a complex diagram that you can't see, but this is kind of looking at the social, economic, cultural, political factors that go into soil erosion. So on the left, it kind of lists like all of the scientific, ecological kind of characteristics that make a soil vulnerable to erosion, and then points to the economic, social, and political forces that kind of make that happen. So like kind of policies that encourage kind of monoculture, plowing, intensive tillage, things like that are all going to kind of contribute to soil erosion. So I guess I like to kind of think about the ecological ideas integrated within like cultural and political systems, because like that influences our environmental decision making, which influences like the health of the environment. So really thinking about and looking at these concepts from like a whole systems perspective, I think helps to create kind of the most transformative opportunities for change. Some of the strategies to increase carbon in the soil, there's a bunch of practices, and kind of just wanted to situate like where compost plays a role in this kind of whole systems perspective of like food systems, soil carbon sequestration, climate. So utilizing mulch and farming with mulch, regenerating woodlands, practicing conservation tillage or no-till practices helps to preserve soil carbon. Cover crops help to build soil carbon, organic matter. Integrated nutrient management, which includes compost, manure, as well as like improved grazing methods, such as like rotational grazing or forest management. Earthworks, which is like water conservation and harvesting techniques, also help to preserve organic matter and build soil carbon. And oftentimes what I come across is that it's really these really diverse integrated cropping systems like agroforestry that integrate trees, livestock, herbs, perennials, vegetables, compost, that really have the strongest effect on soil health and soil carbon sequestration. So I really like to see those more integrated systems. This is kind of a nice example of a little bit of that, where they have animals and trees, vegetable production, compost, all kind of happening in the same space. Essentially, we're basically trying to return organic matter to the soil. That's like one of the major principles behind all of this. And we want to also maintain our above ground and ecological diversity. And I would say biodiversity in general is also a major principle in both soil and compost health, as well as your above ground health with like pest management, plant growth, food production, all of that. Just to summarize, all the different ways that compost supports soil health by mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, increasing soil carbon, soil health indicators, like aggregate stability, which is about the structure, also the water infiltration and water holding capacity, which is related to the structure, the organic matter content. It also helps to enhance disease suppression, so reducing like incidences of root rot or like foliar disease. We'll get to dive into that more on Thursday, I believe. And so enhancing the soil structure helps us to prevent erosion. We also get to sequester heavy metals. So when plants are grown in compost amended soil, they take up less heavy metals than if they weren't amended by compost. So compost helps to bind heavy metals in these like complexes and make them unavailable to plants. So that's helpful. I guess it's a little bit tricky because if the environmental conditions change, potentially those heavy metals could get solubilized again. But for the most part, compost is able to sequester them. And it also has the ability to help bioremediate toxins, and that's mostly like petrochemical pollutants because of the microbiology. And of course, it helps to provide plant available nutrients and increases nutrient storage in the soil, so that's how it contributes to soil fertility. Community composting really helps us to support the alleviation of environmental justice issues, and that's where these kind of really dirty industries are located in low-income communities of color. That includes like landfills, waste transfer stations, kind of dirty power plants, poorly regulated recycling and waste management industries, industrial agriculture, including like concentrated animal feeding operations, or areas where they heavily spray pesticides or chemicals. And that leads to like poor air and water quality, higher rates of chronic illness and cancer in these communities, and generally characterized by a lack of access to healthy, fresh, organic food. And so having, these types of projects in this program really helps to raise the quality of life and the health of the environment and the communities in them. So unfortunately, about 45% of the US population has at least one chronic disease at this point, and you can see like over the last 30 or so years, that number has been climbing up very steadily. And a lot of that is contributed to poor diet and lifestyle factors, and many of those chronic illnesses are metabolic disorders. So kind of orienting towards thinking about the kind of community composting, urban farming projects as like lifestyle and cultural change can help alleviate some of these issues. And really seeing it as a solution for public health and well-being as well. One of the things that's kind of cool, so the microbiome is doing a lot of the work in both our soil and human health. And there's one estimate that our bodies are maybe like 10 times more microbial cells than human cells. And so we're like not really all human, we're like a consortium of the microbial ecology. So it's kind of interesting to think about as like our concept of self is like an ecosystem. And the gut microbiome is very critical to our health. It's linked to our immune system and neurological health, helps to modulate our emotions. Many of these organisms produce precursors to neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin, and help to improve mood. And then they also support our beneficial immune response as well and suppressing diseases. So I like to point out that the soil microbiome and the human microbiome do a lot of similar things. So by enhancing our metabolic pathways and improving our digestion, they enhance nutrient availability in general. As I mentioned, suppressing pathogens, so soil microbes also do these same things and improve plant immune response as well. They help to enhance growth and influence behavior. And in plants, the stress tolerance looks like, tolerance to drought or extreme weather events, extreme heat, extreme cold, predators. So helps to modulate and support their response in that sense. I like to think about kind of compost and organic matter as a way of feeding the soil a whole food diet. So if we're giving it synthetic fertilizer, like it's just like one kind of nutrient, you can pair together other nutrients, but it's just like the ones that are isolated and selected. Whereas if you give your soil a shovelful of horse manure and it gets digested by the soil microbes, you get a whole array of micronutrients, macronutrients, beneficial enzymes, beneficial hormones, and things like that. And that's kind of like, if we, stopped eating food and we decided to live on an IV drip or just eat supplements to get like what we think that we need for our nutrition. Whereas if we eat whole foods, it's the same kind of concept. Our gut microbes are going to digest and provide a whole array of beneficial nutrients and compounds for us, including like antioxidants and things like that. So, if we're thinking about keeping our bodies healthy, we want to eat a whole food diet. And that's the same principle with soil, is to feed it a whole food diet. So talked a lot about the kind of environmental issues. And one of the great things about community composting is that it really gets to deeply support community well-being. And there is kind of research on this field, and people kind of define it in kind of similar, like very integrative, holistic ways. Community well-being is a combination of social, economic, environmental, cultural, and political conditions identified by individuals and their communities as essential for them to flourish and fulfill their potential. There's some different models of what that means. This one is a study that surveyed residents in Flint, Michigan, for how connected and committed and the sense of belonging that they felt in their communities. And they kind of broke that down into 14 different life domains that are important to people. I won't go through all of them, but a lot of it has to do with like your social connection and feeling of belonging in your community. Access to health, safety, political, economic opportunity, environmental health, education, work opportunities, all lead to your perception of your well-being in your community. And all of that kind of contributes to one's commitment to the community. And the decision to kind of stay rooted in a place is a lot has to do, it's infrastructure access, but a lot has to do with kind of the social connection. So some other kind of ways that people have described it are like connectedness, which is like the social connection. Livability is more infrastructure oriented, is like, how walkable, pleasant, access to health and education, food, how good that is. Also a sense of equity. So kind of equity in terms of access to economic opportunity, green spaces, meaningful experiences in the community, things like that. Here's another model that kind of has like health, environment, and economy as like balanced with each other, understanding that economic reasonings are important for supporting health and environment. And so they all need to kind of be balanced with each other. So the health of the community depends not only on the absolute wealth, but on the equitability of that wealth distribution. There's some research on the positive psychological effects of access to green spaces. So, you can list there's a whole list of characteristics like lower stress, positive emotional experience, increased attention, cognitive functioning, improved resilience and coping with stress, enhanced self-discipline, reducing symptoms of depression, facilitating social support and cohesion. Psychological well-being is shown to be enhanced across different types of communities. So this is kind of a more complex framework that talks about like the relationship between social cohesion and urban green space, and kind of talking about urban green space as a cultural ecosystem service. So it's an ecosystem service that facilitates social cohesion, social connection, positive emotional experience, and the kind of motivation for people to stay in their community and choose to contribute positively to their community. So it's really great that we get to kind of do this Community Composting for Green Spaces grant, because it supports kind of all of those different factors kind of coming together, and really supporting kind of a vision for holistic health, you know, starting from the soil and going to the community and back again. So I like to put it into a little symbol and kind of integrate our community composting kind of framework of like where it's useful and helpful as a tool in the toolbox for supporting both ecological and community well-being. And I wrote like some of the kind of factors and characteristics at the top, like climate, waste, soil for ecological, and social, emotional, psychological for community well-being, and then at the bottom is ecological design and community engagement, and those are sort of the ways that we interface and apply those perspectives and principles in practice. I also just really love the metaphor of composting. As I mentioned, the Disappearing Waste Act is pretty cool that compost gets to show us, and it's really powerful because we get to kind of work with the undervalued resource and transform it into something that is more commonly valued. And I feel like it's very powerful to practice that together in community, and kind of embody those principles and metaphors as community practice. And so it's a source of community empowerment in that sense. So we get to shift our views on death as not an endpoint, but part of a cycle of life and transformation and transmutation, and part of the cyclical cycle and pattern of nature. Again, eliminating the idea of waste, and also kind of thinking about destructive forces as part of the creative process, and how destruction and creativity kind of go hand in hand together. So just kind of summarize all the wonderful things about community composting: climate change mitigation, soil health, ecological land management and food production, environmental justice, food security, community well-being, equity, and empowerment. So I just wanted to touch on like why this moment has kind of come to be, and sort of the policy climate that has allowed this opportunity here for us to be experiencing to come together. There's the state legislation, AB 1826, mandatory commercial organics recycling. They're just more kind of maybe large scale oriented, but helps to kind of promote composting in general, and allows municipalities to think about what their kind of organics diversion and composting strategies might be. So kind of helps at least plant a seed about how we want to strategize and move forward with these plans in a way that is good for both people and planet. There's SB 1383, which targets short-lived climate pollutants. There's a number of them, and methane is one of them. And so that also provides some support for community composting. And then there's also more awareness around environmental justice. So we have SB 1000, which is Planning for Healthy Communities Act. And that's kind of a encouragement mandate for municipalities to develop an environmental justice plan of how they're going to address or alleviate those issues. I want to acknowledge some of the other amazing kind of leaders in community composting. The New York City Compost Project has been going on since the 90s, and they've been funded by the Department of Sanitation in New York. They had some funding cutbacks during the pandemic, but I think that's starting to come back. And it's really inspiring a network of like over 200 community compost hubs throughout New York City. There are community gardens, public parks, schools, and things like that. Most of them are volunteer run and grant funded. There are some that are run by paid staff. And they kind of utilize community food scrap drop-off stations at subway stations, community gardens, public libraries. They have also their own Master Composter Certificate program, so that's a great one to check out for inspiration. Also want to acknowledge the program from Institute for Local Self Reliance, which is a really great nonprofit based in Baltimore, I believe, led by Brenda Platt, and they do a lot of great stuff. They also focus on waste and particularly composting, and they also have a neighborhood soil rebuilders program, which is similar to the Master Composters kind of training, where they teach people about composting practices and do field work, community service, and people take on their own compost projects.